and I'm extraordinarily humbled and proud to be here. I want to thank you, Professor Skorecki and Professor Beyar, for your courage, your openness, and your generosity of spirit in inviting me here in such circumstances. I want to thank all of those who I have met this week for their kindness, for their encouragement, and for their insight. I've learned a great deal during the past 3 days. Rambam as a model for partnership between Jews and Arabs. Rambam as a center offering an open hand to the people of Palestine. And Rambam as a place with a unique vision for a peaceful, productive, and diverse future among peoples. Rambamism, as somebody put it to me this week. Today is an opportunity for me, and I believe for us together. But before I talk about that opportunity, I need, very honestly, to set the record straight with you. First, I deeply, deeply regret the completely unnecessary polarization that publication of the letter by Paula Manduca caused. Irrespective of our intentions, which I am very happy to discuss, this outcome was definitely not my intention. Second, and contrary to some incomplete accounts of a conversation with a journalist that I had recently, I was personally horrified at the offensive video that was forwarded by 2 of the authors of that letter. The worldview expressed in that video is abhorrent and must be condemned, and I condemn it. I have made that view, my view, very clear directly to those 2 individuals. Third, I will be publishing what I've just said in the Lancet next week. Let me add, the Lancet is, always was, and under my leadership always will be, 100% open, indeed, more than that, welcoming of research and work submitted to us from colleagues and friends in Israel. I need to say that I have received personally, these past 2 months, some, I can only describe them as vile accusations about me, about my views concerning this country and its people. Let me make it absolutely clear to you. Anyone who makes those claims simply does not know me, does not know anything about my life or my family or my values. For reasons that I find actually quite hard to explain or to understand myself, I have a special feeling for this land on which Israel and Palestine and the wider Arab world and their peoples live. Which is why, over the past 7 years, I have come back again and again and again, every year, often several times a year, to this part of the world. Being here this week provides me with an opportunity to open a new chapter in that relationship. And I will talk about that in a moment. I'm not going to make an argument this morning. I want to tell, very simply, a story of how we get to where we get. Editors can make their readers very angry. A few years ago, we published this on the front cover of the Lancet. It was about President Bush's commitment to global AIDS, and we had a few views about President Bush and his politics, and so we wrote on the front cover because the investment in AIDS was a good investment, but it had a particular perspective on sexual and reproductive health. And so when we wrote an editorial about President Bush, we said this: is it churlish to criticize President Bush for his spending on global AIDS? No, it's not churlish. It's important and necessary. Well, here was the response. Is it churlish? Tell the editor that his smug, arrogant, sanctimonious new Lancet cover sucks. Well, Dr. Warren in North Vancouver, I'm very sorry, we made him very upset. And it's an illustration of how editors can, shall we say, not always make the best of their statements and intentions. Now the title of this talk is about geopolitical responsibilities. Right now, the world is going through an extraordinary crisis, and it's not only a health crisis. The CDC in Atlanta has estimated that if we do nothing, by the end of January, there'll be 1.4 million cases of Ebola in and around West Africa. We call that a failure of international collective action. It's far more than that. Just a week or so ago, I received an email from a colleague at USAID who wrote this: we very much agree on the need to improve the resources and capabilities of multilateral agencies to deadly outbreaks like Ebola. And this will be covered in, and this is the point, health as part of a global security agenda. Health right now in West Africa and elsewhere, as the first case of Ebola was diagnosed in the United States just this week. Health as a huge, important geopolitical threat, as well as responsibility that we share. Now, we knew this. This is not new. And in the fields of epidemiology and public health, we've understood over many years the centrality of politics to health. Johann Mackenbach wrote just a few years ago, human health and disease are the embodiment of the success and failures of society as a whole. And the only way to improve health and reduce disease is by changing society by, therefore, political action. He went as far as to say that politics is public health's biggest idea. Coming closer to home in the United Kingdom, a man who I greatly revere, a gastroenterologist who's long passed now, but who in the middle of his life, as a professor, as a physiologist, as an academic, changed trajectories, John Ryle this is, and founded the United Kingdom's first Department of Social Medicine. And he wrote this in his reflections on his change of trajectory, his kind of midlife crisis in thinking about what he was doing with the direction of his life. And he said this: ethical values cannot be measured as the death rate in infancy, but that there is a relationship between the revelations of vital statistics and human responsibility in a modern society we can hardly dispute. And in a sense, that was his definition of social medicine. Globalize that idea. And in the very founding of the World Health Organization, from the first sanitary conference held in Paris in 1851, all the way through a whole series of intermittent meetings that took place over the course of the next 50 and indeed 100 years, nations understood the geopolitical importance of health and the vital need for nations to come together, to work together, to improve health. Endeavor to take steps in matters of international concern for the prevention and control of disease. Now that's briefly a global story. Let me bring it closer to home at the Lancet. The Lancet's a global journal, but honestly, we're not totally proud of its beginning. The Lancet, in its opening editorial by Thomas Wackley, spoke about our purpose, part of which was to speak to colonial practitioners. Great Britain's, some would say, not so great past as an empire. And we distinguished between two parts of the world, England and the rest of the civilized continent. Well, I hope we do a little better today. Let me give you one example of the Lancet's commitment to some of these international issues that have a political dimension. The International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the very first Congress of which took place in 1981. Please note this. Please note this. I can get this to work. There you are. You, as a nation, were represented at that very first meeting. Now, this movement that was created by two physicians, one in the United States and one in what was then the Soviet Union, came in for incredible criticism as being a vehicle for Soviet propaganda. But, particularly thanks to the efforts of this individual, Bernard Lown, who co-led the IPPNW, he and his co-leader won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. And since you were part of that, I think you should claim the Nobel Peace Prize, at least partly, in the victory that their work achieved. Now, we said at the time of their award of the Nobel Peace Prize this, in an editorial: the political implications of the campaigns voiced by IPPNW and other professional bodies are inescapable. If the medical profession, you and I, flinches from all conceivably political tone, then its influence will be weakened. That message was taken very much to heart by one nation in particular. And I think you're going to guess which nation that is. Because Israel, a year later, created its own chapter of IPPNW. And here was the oath that was given by Professor Marcel Assael at a meeting of the Israel Association of Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War on January the 29th in 1986. I pledge, in order to protect the welfare of the human being, never to use nuclear energy for destructive purposes, and I shall devote my life as a physician to fight against disease, poverty, ignorance, and nuclear war. Ernesto Cahan, who was chairman of the Israel Association of Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, wrote this in the Lancet in 1986. Israeli journalists, authors, social workers, parents, kibbutz members, and many others directly influenced by IPPNW's medical prescription campaign and IPPNW's message to my patient understood the need to join physicians in this crusade against nuclear destruction. Their answer was the foundation of the Israel Committee for the Prevention of Nuclear War in April 1986. You, as a nation and as a people and as health professionals, have been at the forefront of leadership in making health and medicine, our profession, on the front lines of these geopolitical concerns. Let me turn specifically, if I may, to a personal story of my interest in this issue. So as you've heard, I joined the Lancet in the early 1990s and became editor in 1995. And my first exposure to the relationship between health and war came with an invitation, as these things always do. They always come, they don't just magically appear. They come from relationships and friendships and invitations to countries, from two people in Croatia who worked at the Croatian Medical Journal, Anna and Matko Marasic. And then they invited me after the war in Croatia in the early 1990s to come and visit their country, to come meet them in Zagreb, to travel to the city of Vukovar in the northeast of the country, which was utterly destroyed during the war, and down south to Split and Dubrovnik. And in traveling around that part of the world, understanding the importance of health and medicine and writing about health and medicine for a country to understand where it is and what its future can be. That visit had a huge impact on me, but honestly, I did not know what to do with that experience until I met this woman, Jennifer Bryce, who was then working at UNICEF. And Jennifer came into my office, she demanded to meet me, and she said, "Richard, you claim to be the editor of an international medical journal. What do you know about children's health?" And I had to say, I was previously an adult physician, I knew nothing about children's health. And she banged the table, I remember it clearly, in my office and said, "You should be ashamed of yourself." And she then took my hand, quite literally, through a process over 2 years, so that we came to publish our first series in global health on child survival. And this was a revelation to me. At the end of that series on child survival, it was 4 papers describing the human toll of child mortality in the world, the causes of child mortality, but what could be achieved if the world took a different course. But instead of being a series of papers about just the epidemiology and the science, the final paper was a call for action. We, a group of concerned scientists and public health managers, call on WHO, UNICEF, Bank, UNDP, and other UN partners to act on behalf of children by putting child survival at the top of their political priorities. They had an agenda. They wanted child health at the top of political priorities, and they made this very much a campaign. Well, it's over 10 years on from that. And we've had many, many projects. It's actually 50 or 60 similar series that have tried to make the claim for the importance of the issues that they've covered, not just epidemiologically or from a public health perspective, but from a much larger and indeed political perspective. And the conclusions that we've drawn from a decade of work in this area is that science can be a remarkable catalyst for changing policy, that partnerships between people, in whatever domain of study it might be, can deliver impact, that doctors, health professionals, can trigger social action, and that we can actually be leaders of political as well as clinical and public health change. Let me give one very explicit example. We've published 4 series over the years on non-communicable diseases. As you all know, the massive epidemiological transition that is taking place across the world. And just a few years ago, in 2011, there wasn't just a declaration about the importance of non-communicable diseases from a health perspective. When Ban Ki-moon stood to sign this piece of work, it was, and please note, a political declaration, not just a scientific or a health or a medical declaration. To make change, to motivate change, we have to embrace the political dimensions. And that means sometimes it brings us face to face in conflict with huge forces that are shaping our society. When I first visited Ethiopia, this man very kindly drove me around parts of the country in the southwest where I was visiting. And he was a delightful companion during my visit. Now, what's the clinical sign? It's hard to see. Here's the clinical sign. He works for the Ministry of Health, who are all provided with clothes from British American Tobacco. The forces that we face in many parts of the world, shaping health, colluding with the best interests of trying to shape health, can be very powerful and require us to go beyond simply delivering health care. They require us to stand on the front lines and challenge those forces, in this particular case, the forces of transnational corporations. When we think in the context of non-communicable diseases about where we go after the Millennium Development Goals, which end at the end of 2015, and we move into a new era of sustainable development after 2015, 2016 to 2030, we are going to have to rethink our definitions of human development and put sustainability at their core. And for non-communicable diseases, that means thinking about the social dimensions of disease, the economic dimensions of disease, and the environmental dimensions of disease. And I would submit as well the political determinants of disease. In the opening slide, I had a picture from last week's United Nations General Assembly on the climate summit. You know, 10 years ago, I would never have gone to the United Nations General Assembly. Me, I'm a doctor. I have no interest in all of that. There's nothing at that meeting for me. It's a meeting of heads of state. Now, I have to go every year. Why do I have to go? Because for 1 week in New York at the General Assembly, it's all about health. There's an enormous health program running from the early hours of every morning through to the late evening of every day. Why is that? We, a few years ago, wanted to use the Lancet as a vehicle to draw attention to some of these broader issues in health. And the first issue we chose was climate change. It's hard to think that climate change is necessarily a health issue, but it is most definitely and deeply a health issue. And what we wanted to do was to show the benefits of a university, what a multi-faculty university can contribute to our understanding of the broad determinants around a particular risk to health. And here was our collaboration with University College London on a commission on managing the health effects of climate change. The conclusion of this commission was that climate change was the biggest threat facing health in the 21st century. And when we first sat around the table, it was fascinating, this big university, University College London, we brought people together from many different departments who'd never met each other before. And in the first meeting, there was a look of stunned amazement. What were we all doing in a room? What did we have in common? But when you link together medicine, public health, engineering, political science, law, environmental sciences, anthropology, philosophy, economics, and other sciences, bringing those disciplines together, and especially this one in relation to these two, shows us a way, a path of how we can use the evidence that we generate as scientists, the experiences we have as health professionals, how we can direct that in a more productive way to help shape policy. Now let me start getting slightly closer to where we are today. This is all about diseases and epidemiology and so on. But a very close friend of mine, who is now Dean of the Harvard School of Public Health, Julio Frank, back in the early 2000s was Minister of Health in Mexico. And Julio called me and said, "Richard, please come to Mexico City. I want to discuss something with you." The reason why he called me was that as Minister of Health, he had introduced a new set of reforms called Seguro Popular. It was about universal health insurance. And he said, "Richard, the government that I'm a part of, President Fox, is about to change, and there'll be a new president." Turned out to be President Calderon. All the work that we've done to shape the reforms of health in Mexico could be lost at a stroke, because I, as Minister of Health, and my team have no evidence to pass on to the next government. We've done these reforms, but there's nothing in black and white to show the next government about what we've achieved. Please work with me to publish a series of scientific papers to demonstrate the successes and the challenges, this wasn't a public relations exercise, about what had been achieved in Mexico. So this was in 2003, and I went to Mexico, met with Julio. We planned this project, and in 2006, we published a series of papers launched in Mexico City with the Mexico government about the challenges. And it meant that when the government went from one government to another, the next Minister of Health and the next president had this series of papers to say, look at the success, don't throw it away. This was an explicit partnership between scientists, a government, and we were just the vehicle, we were just the midwife, but a medical journal, in making sure that the successes, the political successes in health, were protected and strengthened in the next government. Well, Mexico was quite easy. China has been a little bit more challenging because inevitably in China there's a great deal of pride in what is taking place in that country and a feeling that they don't need to have, in quite the same way perhaps, that support to get where they want to go. But health is an absolutely critical issue for friends in China. And the government has invested in the health system, invested in higher education, invested in science as an explicit means to advance the welfare of its people. I know that China has many problems. And there are many reasons to be concerned about some of the political dimensions in China. But I do not believe in boycotts. I do not believe in cutting off countries because there are concerns about particular dimensions of what they're doing. What I do believe in is partnership to create a relationship of trust so that we can work together for that better future, and using science and the values of medicine and health to support that vision. And that's what we've done in China. We have an annual theme issue on China every year. We've just had it in Beijing, actually last week. And every year we have these China dialogues where we work with the government, the China CDC, to discuss evidence very openly, very frankly, the difficulties as well as the successes. And we, in a sense, are the, how shall I say, the broker between the outside world and the inside world of China. To emphasize, we have to embrace these political dimensions. In a commission we published in January this year with the University of Oslo, we looked at the political origins of health inequity and looked at how we could use those origins to perhaps precipitate change. Now, you know that the Lancet has got itself involved over the years in some difficult controversies. We published back in 2003 a paper on civilian mortality in Iraq, and another paper in 2006 revisiting that question. The mailbag I received after publishing the first paper wasn't terribly supportive, to say the least. But what's so interesting is how opinions change. When we published the first paper on civilian mortality, my colleagues and friends in the United States were deeply critical of the Lancet for getting involved in what they saw as an explicit political issue. Stop interfering with our government, was the message I got. Well, that was at the time when President Bush put up that sign saying mission accomplished. By the time 2006 came round, people had a slightly different view. And when we published that paper on civilian mortality, the message I got back from friends and colleagues in the United States was a different one, which is, thank you for drawing attention to these concerns. Just in the space of 3 years, a completely different perspective on the same issue. The power of research to challenge, but then also to bring people together to understand the consequences of political actions on the health of populations. And coming closer to home here, just a year ago we published an open letter which had, I hope, more constructive outcomes than the reason that brings me here, on Syria, from Gro Harlem Brundtland, a former Prime Minister of Norway and Director General of the WHO, drawing attention to the issue of violations of medical neutrality. It was never my intention to get involved in the political dimensions of health in this region. And every time anybody encouraged me to come here, or Let me change that. Every time anybody encouraged me to write about this region, I always said no, because I had no knowledge or direct experience. And eventually, an invitation did come from Rita Giacomin, who was then leading the Institute of Community and Public Health at the University of Beirut. That's not the current Institute of Community and Public Health, a ramshackle building above a garage. They now have nice offices in the University of Beirut. But this is what it was at the time when I first went in 2007. And Rita Giacomin, combined with an American NGO, Care International, invited me and took me around the West Bank, took me to Gaza, took me to East Jerusalem, to show me some of the issues for Palestinian colleagues that they faced. And we said at the time, well, let's see if we can bring a team together to tell the story of health in the Palestinian territory. And this was our first meeting. We sat around the table to plan what we would do. And eventually, we published a series looking at health in the occupied Palestinian territory. Here's our opportunity. Can we do the same? And this is what I want to make my offer to you today. This series came from an invitation from Rita Giacomin. I'm here today because of an invitation from Professor Skorecki. I'm inviting us, you, to join with us, to work together to tell the story of health in Israel. The successes, the challenges, future prospects, the priorities that need to be addressed, and maybe even some ideas for how we could address them together. This was a series of 5 papers published in the Lancet. We launched it in Ramallah and also in London. Imagine if we worked on a series like this and launched it in Israel somewhere and maybe another place as well, where we thought we would get most interest and attention. That's my offer to you today. When we launched that first series, we've gone back time and time again to Gaza here, seeing people in their homes, living their lives, the silent majority, just like you, just like me, wanting simply to send their children to school, do their jobs, look after their families. They don't represent terrorist regimes. They're just people trying to live their lives as peacefully and as safely as possible. And when I went to Gaza, when I've been to Gaza, what I see, and I know there is another dimension to this, I know that, I'm not naive about it, but this is what I see. Because this is what the people tell me, and this is what they express all around them. That yes, there are reasons to be incredibly regretful about death and destruction. But, just like you, there is a hope for a different future, a future of success, prosperity, safety, and peace. They want it. They try to live it. And it's our hope that we can work with them and with you to achieve it. The way we've done this is through scientific collaboration. And every year we have this thing that we call the Lancet Palestinian Health Alliance, which is where we bring people together from across the region to present work on the lives of Palestinians, not just in Palestinian territory, but refugee populations, the diaspora, across the region. Here's an example of cooperation between the University of Oslo and individuals in this particular case, Beirut. Meeting we held this year was in March in Amman, in Jordan. And please note that we try and build collaborations here. With the World Health Organization, this is a meeting that is done in collaboration with WHO, done in collaboration with charities that are concerned about the health of Palestinians, and with universities. The meeting is a very, at one level, boring meeting. It's presenting research. And of course, there is a political dimension to it because it's about how can we use science to advance the case for the health of Palestinian people. It's an exciting meeting, but what I'm saying is this meeting is about simply presenting science and collaborations. Here, collaborations with King's College in London, looking at mental health in the West Bank, or here, looking at community health work and family planning in the West Bank. It's a research conference, but I don't deny that it has a hope to take that research and make a difference in this region. It's about dialogue. We bring people together to question one another just as at any other scientific conference. And we bring international academics together to act as, in a sense, independent peer reviewers of the work and to ask difficult questions about that work. Harry Shannon from McMaster University, John Yudkin, professor at University College London from the United Kingdom, who come to hold friends and colleagues in Palestine accountable for the quality of their work. So let me make this second offer to you. Let's imagine we succeed in this series. Could we do something similar here? Yesterday, I had the huge privilege of visiting Acco and meeting an imam and a rabbi in that city and how they work together. And at the end, I asked the imam, so what should I do? And he said to me very directly, I have witnesses, he said to me very directly, you must work with Israelis, you must work with Palestinians. And you must work to encourage to bring those two peoples together. So I've had my instructions, and I'm making my offer to you. Let me conclude. Last week at the United Nations General Assembly, the Assistant Secretary General Bob Orr said this: there are more crises in the world today than at any time in the history of the United Nations. What should our response be as professionals from the health community to that predicament that the world faces? Let me give you two answers. They're the same answer, but they're separated by thousands of years. In his work on obligations, Cicero said this: first comes that which we see existing in the fellowship of the whole human race. The fellowship of the whole human race, please. This, more than anything, separates us from the nature of the beasts. And that is our philosophy at the Lancet, the fellowship of the whole human race. Put much more powerfully, perhaps, in this Commission on Human Security, chaired by Sadako Ogata from Japan and Amartya Sen, who talked about the importance of us clarifying the need for a global human identity. Yes, I'm half Norwegian and I am half English. My father came through London in the early 1960s, had a relationship with a woman, and then went off and didn't realize that he had left behind me. And 7 years later, I turn up in Oslo and I knock on his door and I say, I think you might be my father. And he says, no. I said, did you know this woman in 1961? And he said, oh God. And we went off and had a DNA test, and it turned out that he was my father, my biological father. That doesn't matter. What matters is our global human identity. Amartya Sen said this in 2010 in his book, The Idea of Justice. An active and energetic media can play an extremely important part in making the problems, predicaments, and humanity of certain groups more understood by other groups. So, last slide. What do we stand for at the Lancet? 10 years ago, I read this book by Bella Jolt, the first English translation of a book that was actually published in 1948. He was born in Hungary in 1895. He's a writer, quite a radical social critic. His family died in Auschwitz. This book represents the diaries, the edited diaries of his life in the ghetto, living in Hungary, and life under fascism in Hungary. And in describing that ghetto, he introduces a man called Dr. Nemeti, who is trying desperately to continue to live his life as normally as possible despite the hardship and oppression. Now, when I first read this book, which I have here, I can honestly say that my heart skipped a beat when I was reading it, because there's a sentence that appears in it which stopped me in my tracks. And it was this. This man, this doctor, desperately trying to live his life as normally as possible. Perhaps, Joel writes, perhaps because outside he had been a passionate doctor, always studying, keeping up with international developments, reading the Internal Medicine, I don't know that journal, and the Lancet. And that really, really affected me. From a time which I had no experience of, no knowledge of, didn't know the history of, there was a connection with a journal that I happened to find myself the editor of. So, what do we stand for? Perhaps opposite to what many of you think. We stand for equity of health between peoples. The right to the highest attainable standard of health progressively realized. We stand for life. We stand for survival. We stand for resilience. We stand for human flourishing, and we stand for human fellowship. We stand for hope, and we stand for opportunity. We stand for the positive power of writing to shape and change our future. Please, I invite you today, here, to join me for a fresh start for a new and different future. Thank you.